Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about education in Pennsylvania. If you'd like to join our discussion, you can call us toll-free at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. We'll also take questions from PCN's Facebook page submitted earlier. But first, we're joined today by Anthony Hennen, staff reporter with the Center Square. Anthony, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Last week, the House Ag and Rural Affairs Committee voted to move a bill that would criminalize non-veterinary possession of xylazine, also known as tranq. For those that aren't familiar, can you explain what is this drug and why is there such a concern around it?
Yeah, so essentially this is an animal tranquilizer that's starting to appear more and more on illicit markets, especially in the Northeast. Pennsylvania is considered an epicenter of this. But basically, it's a sedative that is now getting mixed in with fentanyl or being used. And it's creating a lot of problems simply because it's not an opioid like fentanyl is. So Narcan, the anti-overdose drug, doesn't affect it. So when someone is overdosing, it's creating more and more of a problem. There's also a lot of health issues for the people using it simply because the human body essentially rejects this. And so when someone uses it, it's essentially forcing itself out through either a cut in the skin, basically any way possible. And a lot of wounds come from it. So now there's a concern, not even only for human health, but also for agriculture and making sure this drug remains available for veterinary use.
Now, you'd mentioned that portions of Pennsylvania are considered the epicenter for the use of this drug. Why do you think that is?
I think some of it's hard to say. I mean, this is just how drug markets operate, where it will pop up some places but not others. But I mean, I think it's hard to ignore Kensington and the drug market up there as a way where this comes in and this kind of evolves from there.
This bill moved out of committee by an 8-6 vote. What were some of the concerns voiced in opposition of this?
Yeah, so it was a 16-8 with one not voting. But yeah, I mean, the concerns are similar to what we've seen with other drugs, with dealing with fentanyl and opioids. Representative Emily Kincaid out of the Pittsburgh area came out as very vocally opposed to this, where she said the bill was well intentioned, but we've seen this with heroin, we've seen this with fentanyl and other opioids, and says this simply will not work because this is not necessarily doing anything differently here. And she's worried that we're essentially going down the same hill here, the same path where we have not been effective at stopping other illegal drugs.
Have veterinary practitioners voiced their concerns or priorities, what they would like to see in a bill regulating this specific drug?
When I spoke with Carl Metzger, who's a sponsor of this bill, he said that they had a lot of conversations with different vet groups around Pennsylvania, making sure they get this right. Their main concerns here were making sure that they still had access to it. There were also concerns in the State House over how this is stored and whether this is a security risk, which I think we'll see become a bigger part of this discussion as the bill makes its way through the State House. But from what I've been told, veterinary groups are essentially making sure they still have access to this because without xylazine to treat cattle, horses, these larger agricultural animals, the only alternative here is euthanasia rather than healing them or fixing a problem.
Have other states passed legislation to deal with the criminal use of xylazine?
I think there's a number of them in the pipeline, or we'll see some in the near future. A number of states have gone and scheduled this as a Schedule 3 or Schedule 4 drug to start limiting possession or use. West Virginia's done this. Ohio did this earlier this year. Pennsylvania as well. I believe in April, Governor Shapiro passed an executive order reclassifying this drug. So it's not necessarily widespread yet. I think that's partially, it's more common in the Northeast than other places. But I expect to see this popping up more in other states.
How has the presence of xylazine affected how service providers address addiction recovery services?
I think it's complicated it, partially because, again, it's a sedative rather than an opioid. So simply dealing with overdoses makes it more complicated. There's different processes for it. But I think also, it's relatively new. We didn't really see this popping up too much until, I believe, about 2016, 2017. I think the public isn't really aware of how this is happening and how this is affecting people on the street. So, we're starting to get a hang of how to deal with xylazine or fentanyl, even though there's a lot of work to be done there. But yeah, I think this is complicated on a health level, but also a recovery level, making sure people are getting reconnected through different recovery services, through establishing new communities and finding a bigger purpose in life to make sure they're not going down the same road they used to.
We've been speaking with Anthony Hennen of the Center Square. Anthony, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
We're going to take a brief break, and we'll be back with more of the PCN Capitol Preview.
Do you love high school sports? Then get ready for a championship weekend on PCN. Kick off the weekend with live coverage of the PIAA Soccer Championships on November 17th. November 18th, PIAA Soccer Championships continue live on PCN. Then stay with PCN for the PIAA Girls Volleyball and Field Hockey Championships on November 19th. PCN is Pennsylvania Sports.
PCN proudly brings you coverage of the Pennsylvania State Legislature. We bring you the State House and Senate floor proceedings as they happen, unedited and complete. Our mission includes committee meetings, budget hearings, interviews with prominent legislators, and other public policy forums. PCN is your destination for the best in Pennsylvania legislative coverage on cable and PCN Select. PCN is Pennsylvania politics and policy. Take a seat in the courtroom and see the real-life cases affecting Pennsylvanians today. Hear the arguments from both sides with full transparency, exclusively on PCN. Watch the Commonwealth, Superior, and Supreme Courts on cable and the PCN Select streaming service. Visit PCNTV.com for the complete schedule. PCN, Pennsylvania Politics and Policy.
Welcome back. Today we're joined by the chairs of the House Education Committee. Representative Jesse Toffer is a Republican representing Bedford and Fulton County, and Representative Peter Schweyer is a Democrat representing parts of Lehigh County. Let's start off by talking about the budget impasse. Representative Schweyer, we'll start with you. Part of the delay was caused by a disagreement over whether to include vouchers for within the school funding proposal. Can you explain?
Yeah, in a nutshell, as it was explained to me, the Governor Shapiro, who has, even throughout the campaign talked about his support for a voucher program, was in conversation with the Senate Republicans on this issue, including $100 million for vouchers, which is something that, frankly, me personally and my caucus just simply does not support. And so it turned into, in a grand scheme of things, of a $48 billion budget, $100 million was really one of the things that held us up. And at the same time, we've seen from our friends in the Senate that they were unwilling to include some significant increases in funding for the Level Up program and some other things that would target and support those most at-risk school districts, including the one where I live in and send my children in. So it became a political football pretty quickly. The one thing that I know is that at this point in time, my caucus is still not supporting the scholarship programs. I know conversations are ongoing between us and the leadership in the Senate.
Representative Topper, what's your view of vouchers and their role in the budget impasse this year?
Well, my view on the budget impasse is that certainly was the issue. My view on the program is I believe it's essential. When it comes to education, a rising tide lifts all ships. We absolutely need to look at our school districts that are in crisis and the communities that are in crisis around them and figure out a way to fix that. But in the meantime, we do have students and our kids who are falling behind in critical areas, and we need to do anything we can to make sure that those kids have opportunities. Do I think that the scholarship program is the end-all, be-all, fix-all to education? Of course not. There is no one fix. But as we move as a state government to try and make this system better, we have to acknowledge that we have a responsibility to those kids. So I think it all works together. I'm in agreement with the gentleman from Lehigh that those talks are ongoing. Those of us, not everybody's in the room at one time, but I'm hopeful that we can come to a consensus and really finish this process off in a meaningful way.
What are the governor's views on the voucher program?
Well, I'm not going to speak for the administration. I think that's something that the governor is going to have to speak, and I think that's been part of the problem through this whole process. His views on the program are one thing, but can you actually get it done? Pete and I talk all the time about we can have the greatest idea in the world. If you can't get 102 votes in the House, 26 in the Senate, and a governor to sign it, then it really doesn't mean anything. So I believe that the governor is where he was when he was a candidate in terms of his support for the program. The question is, can he close the deal and get something done and work with the Senate and the House to do that?
Some legislative Republicans criticized the Shapiro administration for first voicing support for the voucher program, and then ultimately the governor vetoed that portion of the bill. What would you need to see from the administration for your caucus to restore trust in that relationship with the administration?
Well, we need to see, I think, the lines of communication open before we make grandiose statements about what a deal is going to be. That deal needs to be locked in place, because if you say that you support something but you can't deliver the votes, as I said before, then we really don't have anything. So I think there does need to be trust restored. And by the way, not just on our side of the aisle. I think trust needs to be restored throughout the General Assembly and the administration so that we can get something done.
Representative Schweyer, there have been some concerns, particularly from legislative Democrats, about whether or not the existence of a voucher program would take away from the school funding appropriation in general. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the budget is largely a zero-sum game. There are only so many dollars to be spent. And if we're siphoning off $100 million to give to a bunch of kids who, let's be honest, they're not necessarily going to be inner city Philadelphia kids or inner city Allentown kids that are going to necessarily go to these, these private schools. What happens is you're taking $100 million away from where the overwhelming majority of students go to school, which are traditional public schools. Not only that, we have great needs in the education world that go well beyond just simply funding our public schools. A few years ago, we were generating over 15,000 young people and second career folks that were becoming certified teachers. Last year, I think the number was 4,700. We're producing a third fewer teachers than we actually need in Pennsylvania. And the House Education Committee in the House has passed a number of bipartisan bills, things that would improve what we're calling the teacher pipeline to try to incentivize and get more and more people to enter the field of education. Combined, all of those programs would cost in excess of $100 million. So that's just another example of something that we could be doing that would improve the overall education system without siphoning it off and giving it to a bunch of private schools that, in many ways, candidly, pick and choose the winners and the kids that can go to their institutions. So I have a very real problem with taking money away from our traditional public schools, frankly, our charter schools, and all of the other things that we need to be doing to improve our education system to give it to a bunch of private schools. It just doesn't make sense to me. If I may, real quick, Francine, though, I want to touch upon the question of trust with the administration that my friend Chairman Topper mentioned, and the question that you asked him. I will say, from our caucus perspective, Governor Shapiro was a member of our caucus. Governor Shapiro is somebody that I, frankly, on a personal level, I've known since he's been a lawyer in suburban Philadelphia, and so from my perspective, I know where he stands on the issue of vouchers. I know where his heart is at on the issue of education. We just simply disagree on the issue of vouchers, and now it's time to move forward, finish this last budget, and start working on the next one. It's only going to be a couple months until Jesse and I are sitting in the chamber listening to what the governor's vision is for the next budget.
The governor signed a budget bill in August. The fiscal code bills remain to be completed. But in the meantime, how did education fare in this year's budget?
It depends on your perspective. Overall, I would say, there was almost $600 million of additional funding that flows through the Basic Education Funding Commission. There's additional funding in there for the Basic Education Funding. Jesse's going to laugh because we've been doing the Basic Education Funding Commission stuff, and it's kind of on our mind. But an additional money for special education. That's the good news. The bad news is that we're still not in any meaningful way addressing school construction. We've heard from dozens of superintendents from across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that have mentioned the need for additional school construction. We've stopped funding it about 5 or 6 years ago. We have not included to date additional level up funding, which again goes to the most at risk, the bottom 20 school districts when it comes to education equity. And we still haven't passed what are known as non-preferreds, which is funding for Pitt, Penn State, Temple, Lincoln, and the University of Pennsylvania Veterinarian School that helps provide in-state tuition for Pennsylvania residents. So there's still significant work that needs to be done. So it's a mixed bag, to be perfectly honest.
Now, Representative Schweyer had referenced the two of you both serve on the Basic Education Funding Commission, which has begun a series of hearings that will continue throughout the fall. What is your ultimate goal to come out of these hearings?
Our ultimate goal is to find a better way to fund the system. It's not just about the amount of dollars. Of course, that's always part of the conversation and should be. But it's also about how those dollars are driven out, especially in response to the court ruling for earlier. And Chairman Schweyer and I, we agree on some things when it comes to education. We disagree on some things, but we both agree on one thing. And I think this is essential, including with the administration, is that it shouldn't matter what your zip code is in terms of having access to a high quality education. So we're trying to rally around that common theme. And that's why I'll push back a little bit on what Pete said about the scholarship program and why, as we go through all of this with public education, it still needs to be a part of it. I do believe that a lot of the kids that would benefit from that are not necessarily from wealthy suburban districts, but they are more from maybe poor rural Appalachian districts like I represent, or districts that are in crisis in Allentown, as Pete referenced, or Philadelphia. Will it benefit all of the kids? No, because there's only a certain amount of funds. But I don't see that money so much as going to private institutions as I do to the kids who would benefit from them, including in some of those areas. We talk about what the program is designed to do, which is the bottom 15% of performing schools. And we can talk about why those schools are performing the way they are. And I don't use the language failing schools. I use the language schools in crisis. That crisis can be brought about by a lot of different things. But also the kids who are 250% and families below the poverty level. So we're really talking about families that don't have another option. Now, again, we'll go back to trying to figure out a way to work that in the overall picture. In terms of the funding commission, that's really not our role. Our role is to design how the dollars go out through a formula. I agree with Chairman Schweyer that school construction, he and I have been on this since the beginning of the session, that we need to make sure in some form or fashion dollars are made available for that. I would have loved to have seen so much of that COVID money that came from the federal government to be used in that way. Unfortunately, we were not able to get that done because you have those kind of one-time dollars available to make an investment one time in some of the issues that we need to take care of. Some of the buildings that are just in whether it be in Allentown or Philadelphia that we've heard that are just simply too old, that need renovated, and then in some areas that need new buildings altogether. The state can help in that. I would have liked to use those one-time dollars. It didn't happen, so we need to figure out another way to make it happen. But all of those are coming into play in the Basic Education Funding Commission because we will have to make a recommendation to the General Assembly about how to move forward, particularly in light of the court ruling, and how we fix funding and how schools are funded in the Commonwealth.
Can you talk briefly about the hold harmless provision, what it is, and whether you see that continuing moving forward, or is there a possibility that may be done away with a new formula?
Hold harmless, which I represent some hold harmless districts, which means you can never get less than what you received the year before, regardless of whether you're losing population. So let's say you have a school district that over the past 10 years has steadily declined in student population. You aren't able to receive less funding each year from the state. But where that, of course, is problematic is in schools that are having a lot more students come into their areas. They're not able to receive perhaps the amount of state funding that they should because there's only so much money out there. So I think we need to look at it. I've been an advocate of looking at it from the beginning. I think there has to be an element of stability in school funding. You can't simply rise, ebb and flow. School districts have to figure out what their expenses are going to be and have to count on a certain amount of money coming in. So I think there's always going to be a certain element of hold harmless. But do we need to update the formula? Absolutely, and that's what we're looking to do.
Representative Schweyer, what can be done to address disparities, whether they're economic, geographic, racial, whatever? What can be done to make sure that the education funding is spread out more fairly?
I appreciate that question because I think it really gets to the very heart of what we're looking at. in the very heart of the court case. We referenced it several times, but not only do people like me who live in one of the school districts that is on the lower end of the funding scale, and see it each and every day, but now we have a court case that is declared the way that we fund our schools to not just be dumb and broken, but also unconstitutional. And so what we've seen and what we've heard through those hearings is that no matter what we ultimately decide to do, whether we look at consolidation of school district operations, if we look at potentially school mergers, if we look at changing the way that we fund our schools from looking at different ways that we structure local property taxes and all that sort of stuff, at the end of the day, nothing is going to help us with our most disadvantaged school districts to catch up like an infusion of money. And I know it's trite. I know it's, you hear it all the time. All Democrats want to do is spend money. But the God's honest truth is that when you're spending thousands of dollars less per student in one school district compared to the next one over, there's a very real problem with that. We've heard from experts that have talked of infusing upwards of anywhere from $4.5 billion to over $6 billion of additional funding, not 1 year, but ramping up into that. That will help close those, not only those achievement gaps, but also close the gaps in what we call equity amongst the school districts. It's got to be a major part. It's got to be the sole focus that we have. People love to say we just need to reconfigure the amount of money that we're spending, but it's number one, it's not realistic, just simply from a political standpoint. But even more so, it is not my goal, and I would say it's not Chairman Topper's goal to take away from a high achieving, wealthy school district, take money away from them and put it into the next one. I represent a poor school district that right next door to me is an exceptional school district. I don't want that exceptional school district to have less. I just want my kids to have what they have. And that's what we're hearing across the Commonwealth. I think we'll continue to hear that when we do our Western PA swing. And that's got to ultimately be the goal. And that's what the experts in education policy, equity policy are telling us we have to do.
What can we learn from other states? When you compare how other states do education funding, how does Pennsylvania compare both in the amount of funding that we provide, but also perhaps how it's distributed?
The amount of funding question is always a very tricky one. Because, if you think about Allentown, most people think, well, you got Dorney Park. Well, no, I don't. Dorney Park is not in the Allentown School District. It's not in the city of Allentown. It's in the Parkland School District in South Whitehall Township. What does that mean? That one of the highest property taxpayers in the greater Lehigh Valley area doesn't contribute to the Allentown School District at all. So, and that happens everywhere across the Commonwealth. Every one of our 500 school districts has that very issue. Some of them are fortunate enough to be in an area of the world that has high taxes. They have not fortunate for high taxes, a solid property tax base, manufacturing, warehouses, those sorts of things that generate a lot of financial abilities. And then you got ones that are too small, too rural, too urban, to whatever, and they just simply don't generate enough property taxes. So when you look at the overall spend number, you will hear people say that we spend a lot. But when you look at the overall share of state support, we're in the 40s of 50 states. So it really is a combination of two things. The ultimate goal is to make sure that the school districts that are performing well aren't harmed, and that the school districts that need assistance are funded. Last point, and then I obviously want to make sure that my friend and colleague, Chairman Topper, gets a chance to respond. The other thing that we're hearing throughout the Basic Education Funding Commission is that not all kids are the same. My school district, I have 26 languages spoken from 51 nations of origin. That's a lot. Those kids are different. They bring with them very different life experiences. They bring with them very different cultural experiences. And even just within my own district, of the people that are native to the city of Allentown and native to the school district, we have kids that have experienced extraordinary trauma. We've seen kids that are very, high functioning, very fortunate kids that have, a stable family. We see all of the above, and we have to account for those differences in kids as we create our next funding structure.
Representative Topper, your thoughts on how Pennsylvania compares to other states?
Well, Pennsylvania is different than other states. We hear that all the time. And look, there's always advantage to looking. You know, I like to look at our southern state in Maryland for how they do their countywide systems. I've always been an advocate of trying to consolidate, not necessarily school districts into other school districts, but school systems. The regionalization and sharing of services like they do in Maryland, I think is a good model to look at. However, Maryland's different than Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is almost like a country in and of itself when you look at how different we are from a geographic perspective, from a demographic perspective. We're very different. We've heard it said a lot of times. Pennsylvania is, you know, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Kentucky in the middle, right? Like it is definitely unique. So there are always going to be unique circumstances when it comes to funding. But what Chairman Schweyer says is absolutely correct. No student in Pennsylvania is the same. No school district is the same. So there has to be part of whatever we develop to be dynamic. And that's also why, you know, school choice is a big educational choice, is a big element of it. Regardless of how we make this work, we know that students learn differently. I have 2 teenage boys in public school right now in the Bedford Area School District. They both learn differently. COVID affected them differently. You know, one is able to kind of see that idea of looking at an iPad and figuring it out and taking a couple hours. The other one is definitely needs more of that face-to-face instruction. So we see within our own families different learning objectives and different learning abilities, and we also have to translate that into our school system. That is complex. Not every kid is going to be able to succeed because there are so many circumstances around it. But our job as policymakers, and I've said this many times, is to make sure that each student has the opportunity to succeed. And the number one choice for most families will always be the traditional K through 12 public school system. That's why we need to address it. We can't just say that, oh, well, forget about that, let's give kids other options. That is the option for the majority of our constituents. And we have to make sure that those schools are working effectively, are funded effectively, and also that the standards that we're setting are real standards. And not necessarily, I'm not just talking standardized testing. We know the kind of standards we're looking for, graduation rate. The workforce really is a reflection of our educational system. And for a lot of those, we call them schools in crisis, the reason that their communities are in crisis, that's what we need to look at. Whether it be crime, whether it be businesses able to come in and move in and bring with them jobs. If that's not happening, it will be very difficult for a school system within those communities to thrive. So this is a really big picture, and all of it falls on us as policymakers to try and figure that picture out and make sure that we do the best we can for those students.
We'll continue our discussion in just a moment, but first let's take a look about what's coming up on PCN. Join us for a double dose of On the Issues this week as we look toward the 2023 election. Carolyn Carluccio joins us to discuss her run for Pennsylvania Supreme Court, followed by Joe Rockey talking about his candidacy for Allegheny County Executive. Those air Wednesday night beginning at 6 p.m. This week on Journalists Roundtable, we're joined by Stephen Caruso from Spotlight PA, Steve Ulrich from Politics PA, and JD Prose from Penn Live. That's Thursday night at 6 o'clock. Throughout October, PCN celebrates the 75th anniversary of cable television. Join us for interviews and panel discussions with cable pioneers, along with a look at the future of the industry. Tune in every Sunday night at 8 p.m. and Thursdays at 7 p.m. All the great public affairs, event coverage, and interviews that you watch on PCN are now available for free online at PCNTV.com and on PCN Select. And if you like what you see on PCN, thank your local cable provider. They carry PCN on their channel lineup as a public service. We receive no state or federal tax dollars. And just a reminder, our phone lines are open. You can call us at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. Now, with discussion about school funding always leads to discussion about property tax. Representative Topper, maybe if you could just talk briefly about the pros and cons of state versus local control.
Well, first of all, the reason that property taxes are used is they are a stable form of taxation, which school districts count on. But the using the property tax system and having kind of a hybrid system of part state and part local funding, that is truly what drives the inequities that we're talking about. Because clearly, as Pete pointed out earlier, the systems with the greater tax base, they're going to have more money at their disposal. And so as long as we keep any part of that with tax bases, then you're going to have a greater tax base whether it be the nicer football stadium or whether it be a nicer building, those are always going to be somewhat contributed to by local tax dollars. I also want to make the point that we hear in these hearings all the time, tax-based, taxpayers. Well, remember, that's where we get our money from as well. I mean, it's not like the state money just appears off the state money tree. We're also getting it from tax dollars. So it's all tax dollars, and whether it's local or state. The question of local control really is, what are we giving them control of locally? Is it about just picking the prom date, or is it about actually curriculum, standards? If those are going to be controlled from the local level, then more of the money will come locally. I think if we're going to inject more money from the state level, then we also need to develop state standards that we believe need to be universal throughout all of our school districts. That's a part of it. It's not really taking away local control. It's just coming to an understanding of, if we're going to judge how our tax dollars are going into it from a performance aspect, how are the districts doing? Well, then we need to establish those metrics to be somewhat universal throughout the state. Do those metrics need to be adjusted to be more than just standardized testing? I absolutely believe that they do. But they also need to be somewhat standard. There was a great op-ed that came out yesterday by the president of Penn State, that Penn State, in trying to figure out a way forward with some of the non-preferred funding that the chairman alluded to earlier, how to make that better. And that is a university that says, okay, we're going to take some steps towards accountability, transparency, and performance-based metrics. And having someone like Penn State step out and do that, I hope is an example to everyone at both the basic K through 12 level as well as our higher education level.
Representative Schweyer, would you like to talk as well about your views on state versus local control?
I mean, I think Chairman Topper did an exceptional job. I mean, Jesse and I sort of look at this in much the same way, to be perfectly honest. If there's going to be a massive infusion of state dollars, which I argue needs to happen, we're going to have a level of understanding that those dollars are being used appropriately, number one. That those dollars are actually going to impact the overall education opportunity and ultimate success of our students. You know, when we talk about putting money in the school district and when we're into public schools, when we talk about, changing the way that we look at different taxes, all those sorts of things, really the ultimate goal, whether you send your kid to an urban public school like I do, or you send your kids to a rural public school like Jesse does. At the end of the day, our goal is to make sure that our kids have opportunities and are able to achieve a level of success that they're unable to do today. And so we're not going to just blindly give, potentially billions of dollars to school districts without some level of oversight. And that I think most school districts understand that. I think most folks that work for those school districts understand that. And I don't think that statewide taxpayers, the ones that all of us represent, the ones that Governor Shapiro represents, the ones that send us to Harrisburg, would expect anything different from us. Now, we're not going to do that in a vacuum. And Jesse and I aren't going to sit around and saying, okay, kids need to be able to achieve X, Y, or Z. It's all going to be part of an ongoing conversation, along with our friends at the Pennsylvania Department of Education and the Board of Education, to make sure that those are collaborative. But there's going to have to be, as Jesse said, standards, and there are going to be metrics that need to be achieved, and it's going to be tied to funding questions. I mean, I don't expect every kid to be able to graduate high school with a degree in calculus. I do expect every kid to be able to graduate high school and be prepared for either a job or be prepared for post-secondary education. That's not unreasonable. I think that's something that everybody wants, and we're going to continue to push that forward.
Let's take a call. This one from Philadelphia. Devin, you're on PCN.
Hi, good morning, representatives. How are y'all this morning?
Doing well.
Well,
Great.
thank you, Devin.
I wanted to know, since there's so many vacancies, not only for teachers, but also for principals. I saw a friend of mine, she's an assistant principal, and she said that throughout her district, they got 20 vacancies for assistant principals or principals. Is there a way that they could have a program for people that want to become aspiring administrators or even business executives that have experience in, curriculum, if they're maybe from an educational organization or have budget experience in HR? Is there a way that they could bridge them maybe to address that principal shortage?
Yeah, first of all, it's an exceptional question, and I think it's a very important topic because the quality of the building is quite often determined by a school building. It's determined by the leadership in that building. I think we all know that. There's really kind of two things that we could talk about, Devin. And again, I really appreciate the question. First is overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, our building leadership usually comes from the ranks of teachers. Teachers, will be in a classroom for 5-10 years. They'll go and they'll get their principal certification. They move their way up. That's also very, very different from what happens with the superintendencies and HR departments, as you mentioned, and all of those other sorts of things. So, addressing the teacher pipeline will also give us the inherent benefit of having more and more people in the field of education. I want to give Chairman Topper a tremendous amount of credit. We disagree on things. But one thing that we absolutely understand is that we need more people in the role of professional education. And so whether we do that, by creating scholarships, which is something that we passed out of the House, student teacher stipends, which is something that we passed out of the House, grow your own programs, which are extremely popular in other parts of the nation, where somebody might start as a paraprofessional or somewhere else in support networks, but then with a school district, but then are able to get to have an easier path to become educators. That's all these things were passed bipartisanly out of the House and frankly are stuck in the Senate. Part two of that question are those returning teachers and those second career folks that are moving into the business side. We are very, very interested in trying to find different career paths, different ways for folks to get in there. It's something that Chairman Topper, Jesse, has asked us to do hearings on. That's something that we're planning on doing later this fall or early next year on creating more and more pathways for folks to become building leaders, administrators throughout the school district, and also teachers.
Absolutely. And the reason why I support that is because sometimes, and I've said this before when I've spoken to education groups in this position as Republican chairman in the education committee, I've said the problem sometimes is in the education field, you can just put the blinders up because everyone has grown up through the system of education. It does help to have a fresh perspective from time to time from outside the world of academia to actually come into a school district and say, okay, I'm going to look at this with a little bit of a new perspective, how we can do things better. I want more of that infused into our educational system because I think it benefits the system. When we talk about shortages in teaching and administrating, absolutely, because we have shortages everywhere in our workforce, and education is no different. How do we make education more appealing? Well, fixing the system will help. It will help to attract, I think, people, especially in maybe their second career. Look, it used to be you found your career coming out of school and you stayed there for 40 years. That's not the case. That's not the trend in any field today. So we need to tap into that in education and say, you might not have started here, but this is a place where you could thrive and have those pathways be much easier, much more accessible, frankly, much cheaper for people to be able to get into and bring those skill sets from outside into education. I think that's an important part of what we do.
During the governor's budget, I'm sorry, go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Francine. If I could jump in one more time. I mean, Chairman Topper, Jesse told me a story about a college professor out his way that was struggling to get his teacher certification or didn't understand why he had to jump through all the hoops to go and get that teacher certification to be able to teach K through 12. I will tell you, my daughter's favorite, one of my daughter's favorite teachers, my oldest daughter's favorite teachers, it was a chemist for 15 years before she decided to teach chemistry at our high school. Not only was she at an age where some of the challenges of being in an urban district, she had seen a little bit more, but also she had such remarkable practical real life experience that has inspired a generation of kids to pursue fields in sciences, whether it's chemistry or another related science. So finding those educators and finding those professionals across are really, really, really important. And lastly, the one thing, Devin, and this is what I'm going to ask you, and this is what I'm going to ask all of our viewers back home. One thing, Chair Topper and I have had this conversation. We have to stop demonizing the profession of education. I started my career as a school teacher in West Philly. Jesse's father was an accomplished public school teacher, history teacher in the Bedford area for years. These are people that live in our neighborhoods. There are coaches. They are, sometimes deacons or pastors. These are folks that are get up and go to work every day and try to make the lives of our kids better. So for all the listeners there, before we start randomly criticizing folks or falling down the rabbit hole of taking cheap shots at folks, let's stop and think about what these folks do every day, the circumstances that we as a community put them in, and just have a little bit of grace if you're upset with a teacher. Have a little bit of grace if you're upset with a principal, because we as a community need to make this job more appealing for folks.
You both referenced that the higher education is not completely taken care of yet regarding the state budget. The non-preferreds, including the state-related schools, required a 2/3 vote. Representative Topper, can you talk a little bit about what were some of the concerns of your caucus that are behind this not moving forward at this time?
Well, some of the concerns are some of these universities need to start taking a step toward us as well. One of the reasons we're having trouble in basic education, whether it be a teacher pipeline program or quite frankly the workforce altogether, is higher education has become non-accessible in some cases financially, but also a place where, particularly in areas like my district, parents are starting to have a real concern about sending their kids. And whether some of those issues are real or perceived, they're issues. And I've had a pretty good working relationship with a lot of our institutions of higher education. Our PASHE system has received historic increases in funding over the past several years because I believe that we have a system that is willing to step towards what we're looking for in terms of transparency and accountability. We have not seen that from all of our state relateds. I do believe that this, again, I'll point everybody to the president of Penn State's op-ed yesterday. I think that was a big step forward for someone to show leadership. We need to see that from our universities and our systems of higher education throughout Pennsylvania. It needs to be more accessible. It needs to be more affordable. It needs to be more geared toward what we need in Pennsylvania. And we have, frankly, not seen that over the past few years. So look, I'm in support of it. I'm in support of funding our institutions of higher education, but they also need to take some steps towards us and showing that, yes, excuse me, choked on some water, that they recognize there's a problem. The administration recognizes that. That's why they've put together, I don't know if it's called a task force, maybe Pete can help me out with that, but the group who is looking at how can we make higher education better. I remember during the governor's budget address, he spoke about that. He said, what we're doing now isn't working. We need to do it better. And there was one guy that stood up and applauded. I felt very lonely in doing that as I looked around like, oh, nobody else cares. Higher education, sometimes we can think, well, look, it's not totally our responsibility. We'll let the schools figure it out. We need to figure it out because there are some issues with how we're doing it and the accountability that we're requiring from those institutions. I think if they follow President Beneputi from Penn State's lead and take some of those steps, I think we're going to find common ground a lot quicker than if we just keep this, neither one of us are going to move on the issue.
Representative Schweyer, can you talk a little bit about higher ed funding and where we are perhaps in negotiations with the other caucuses to address some of the concerns that have been voiced?
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of very, very quickly. I mean, the concerns that we're hearing almost, I don't want to say exclusively on the House side. I'm sure that a number of senators have expressed similar concerns, and Jesse could probably talk about that a little bit more. First of all, understand something. We have a very robust public higher education system, whether it's our community colleges or our PASHE schools. The state-related schools are Pitt, Penn State, Temple, Lincoln, are in this sort of in-between phase where they're somewhat private, but they get a tremendous amount of public support as a direct result of our overall desire to make sure the Pennsylvania students have the ability to go to one of these institutions at a more reasonable rate than they would if they were an out-of-state student. I myself am a very proud Penn State alum. And I started at a local branch campus, matriculated up to University Park, and was able to graduate with a degree. And from my perspective, our state-related systems actually are quite accessible. They're not necessarily the way to, and they provide so many different pathways to be able to get there. Now, I do hear my friend and colleague, Chairman Topper, talk about performance-based budgeting and some transparency issues. Certainly fine with having those conversations, and we'll continue to have those conversations. But while those conversations are happening, we can't put our students in a position to have a tuition hike while Harrisburg, is engaged in longer in-depth conversations about a better way to construct this light bulb, as they say. And so I give Chairman Topper a great deal of credit, because frankly, there weren't a whole lot of Republicans that were willing to vote for funding for institutions of higher education as we have these longer term conversations. I mean, frankly, a few more of members of the Republican Party that would have voted for it, we wouldn't be in this mess, and we'd still be able to have these very meaningful conversations. I agree with him that President Benapati has done an exceptional job of having those conversations. I read that op-ed that she wrote, last night as well. I think there's a real movement, a real conversation, and a very meaningful way of hearing that maybe we need to have a little bit more oversight. Maybe there's a little bit more accountability, and ultimately making sure that those dollars are doing what we intend them to do, which is generate the next generation of Pennsylvania college grads that will not only be successful in their career path, but also make sure that we're training the next generation of scientists, of business leaders, of nurses, of teachers, those major areas of need that we have in the Commonwealth. In other words, long story short, we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. We should be passing this funding now, so that our students aren't getting a tuition hike, while still having those ongoing conversations that are very valid points that are being brought up by Chairman Topper.
Just briefly, Representative Schweyer, do you have any sense of a timeline regarding when votes on higher education funding or other non-preferred appropriations will return to the floor for a vote?
No, not at this point in time. I know conversations are ongoing. I know our leadership is working across the aisle trying to figure that out, trying to cobble together the number of votes. And when I say that, just for the listeners at home, this funding is different than every other bill. Every bill, it's just a simple majority. You need 102 members of the House, 26 members of the Senate, and the governor. This one, you need 2/3 votes. So you need bipartisan buy-in and cooperation for this funding, which I don't have any inherent problem with. I think there's a real value in having bipartisan cooperation on this. But I'm not sure when we're going to actually be able to cobble together those votes to be able to pass it.
We are out of time. Representative Schweyer, Representative Topper, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
PCN's Larry Casper spoke with Representative Steve Malagari about Grinch Bots.
Tell us, step by step, what happens when a software program finds tickets to buy?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. I really do appreciate being here. So what happens step by step? So you have a piece of technology, if you will, code that is written up. And what it does is it literally goes through and looks for tickets to purchase. It acts as a human being. It does everything to get around any loopholes of security that might be there. So if, putting in a password or a passcode, we all know those different things to prove you're not a robot. Well, it is able to prove it's not a robot, even though it is a bot. And what it does is it gets into that line and leaps in front of the queue and then starts to gobble up a lot of the available tickets that are left for an event that one might be willing or wanting to go to, purchase for a loved one, purchase for a kid, or even just try and get themselves into a event space to see a concert or a performance.
How does a software program decide how high it can mark up a ticket anyway?
Well, the software program, I'm not sure exactly how it can mark up. Really, the issue right now is just the accessibility of getting the ticket itself. Now, on the back end, after a third-party ticket vendor, if you will, reseller, purchases those tickets, then it can, within its own code or within its own program, mark up as much as it wants. And I think based upon the supply and demand aspect of the actual ticket or event, that's where they can make a determination on how high a price could go. So think about it this way: if you're going to buy a ticket, we'll pick on Taylor Swift again. She's in the news this week, of course, so we'll pick on her again one more time. Wonderful Pennsylvanian and a great performer. So people wanted to get to her concert this past summer when she went on tour. It was about a year ago that they started buying these tickets, trying to get in line to get them. So they released them. And what happened was when they released the actual tickets, people tried to get them. The site crashed. We all knew that. And then they were unable to purchase a lot of tickets because the bots were starting to buy them all up. They were able to circumvent any kind of line. So once they did, then the resale platform, or whoever's really on the back end running it, determines based upon the supply and demand how many they have, how many's left, and what the markup was. So you could see upwards of 100%, 200%, 300% markup, maybe even 400% or higher based upon that demand.
So if a ticket buyer feels they've been ripped off, what recourse do they have?
Well, right now there technically is a law on the books. And it didn't really go far enough. That was done, I think, when Rendell was potentially governor. And also, I think Corbett had, when he was attorney general at the time, they actually went through this as well. There isn't really much of a recourse aside from, you can make a complaint to the attorney general's office now, but there really isn't any teeth behind the legislation that can apply any penalties to the reseller or even the purchaser.
And it probably doesn't help that some super fans are out there and they're willing to pay these exorbitant markups anyway.
Well, there are super fans. The question is if you're looking at it as a way of a consumer, first you want fair access to the ticket. You want fair access to the event. As a performer, you'd want fair access for your own people to get there. So these are your real fans, not necessarily a bot that is pretending to be a fan. But at the same rate, to a performer, you want to make sure that those that are invested in you have that opportunity to see you perform. They're the ones buying your merchandise. They're the ones buying your records. They're the ones buying, we don't probably use much vinyl anymore, but the ones buying your songs online, digital format, whatever it may be, they're the ones actually supporting you. And if they don't have that opportunity to actually get that ticket, then they're not going to come back. They're going to have a salty taste left in their mouth, and they're potentially not going to support you one more time. So as a performer, you probably want your fans to be able to access your venue and access your concert. Now, for those that have the means, they can potentially purchase these tickets at exorbitant amounts above what the standard market rate would be. But we have to ask ourselves, is that really a good thing for us to do? There was a story on TV that I was watching recently. It had to do with Major League Baseball, and also actually the NBA. It was Jim Gardner doing an interview with Charles Barkley, and they talked about the exorbitant amounts that people pay to go see an NBA game. Well, at the end of it, a good quote was said that it's just a whole stadium full of very wealthy people at the time. So if you think about it, now you're talking about a whole concert venue full of really wealthy people. How is that good for anyone to want to continue to grow their fan base and also to gain access to an artist that they really like?
Representative, we only have about a minute left. So tell our viewers how your bill would help consumers.
So this bill, basically what it does is it actually allows for penalties to be drawn onto the vendor. So it protects the actual ticket seller, the original ticket seller that's contracted with the artist, and they would have recourse legally to go after those that are doing the reselling for exorbitant amounts using bots, and it bans bot use in ticket sales.
All right, Representative Steve Malagari, thanks for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That concludes today's show. Tomorrow on the PCN Capitol Preview, Senate Majority Leader Joe Pittman and House Majority Leader Matt Bradford join us to discuss the latest news about the state budget. That's tomorrow morning starting at 9 a.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.